we're almost there. Just a little further. There's the light. Come, keep coming. We're almost there. We've made it. That was an oft-repeated encounter that my brother and I used to have in a particular hedge. You see, when we were little, my brother and I, when our parents used to go away for holidays, we used to stay with some of their friends. And they lived just outside of Devonport. And they had this wonderful old house. There was a beautiful garden. And there was a hedge at the very bottom. And my brother and I used to dare each other to run through it. It was huge. It was dark. And it was really scary. You had to climb through branches, over branches, around branches, and it was really, really dark, so you couldn't see where you were going. And it was all the more frightening because we were convinced that a witch lived on the other side of the hedge. But then you would see the light at the end and you would pluck up courage to keep going until you finally burst out into the sunlight at the end. And you'd burst out a little braver, perhaps a little wiser, as you'd faced challenges and you'd dealt with them, and perhaps you'd been able to run through a bit quicker than last time. So you were certainly changed by this experience. And so why did we keep doing this, my brother and I? Why did we keep going through this huge tree? For us, this tree, this hedge, it was a space that tested us. We thought we were proving ourselves. We thought that, we were brave, that we could do really difficult things. And so this tree, it changed us, and that I still remember that is testimony to that and how important it was in my upbringing. And we hear today that a tree was a place of change for Zacchaeus, the chief tax collector that we read about or heard about in our reading from Luke's Gospel this morning. Zacchaeus, he wanted to change. He sought out a man, and he sought out a tree to see, and he left that tree a different man, a completely changed man. He changed all because of this man who gave his own life on a tree. And as Zacchaeus was changed, so too may we be changed. So, let's meet Zacchaeus. Who was Zacchaeus? Now, we read that Zacchaeus was the chief tax collector. There are a number of implications for this. Now, firstly, Zacchaeus was hated because of his job. He lived in Jericho, and that was a well-known transit route for goods passing from the east to the west. And taxes were collected on these goods as they went through Jericho, and taxes were also collected from the people who lived there. So then, like now, there was a tax rate, and say, for example, it was, say, 5%. But it wasn't just 5%, was it? Because it was common practice for tax collectors to not just collect this 5%, this base rate, but to also add on a little bit more. After all, there were bills to pay, there were people to pay, all sorts of things. So it seemed reasonable that they would add a bit more on. So Zacchaeus, he might have charged, say, 6%, and then maybe 7%, and then maybe 8%, and so on. And verse 8 gives us the impression that Zacchaeus actually was really quite greedy. He admits that he himself defrauded people. His life was built around getting the best, getting the most, getting the biggest for himself, and at the expense of others. People would have walked past his house, giving it a wide berth, but walking past it, knowing that they had paid for the renovations, his extra chariot in the garage, his extra slaves, etc., etc. This was their money. And Zacchaeus, he would have enjoyed the amenity, the luxury, would have been fabulous for him. And secondly, he also would have enjoyed the prestige and the power that came from this wealth, this considerable wealth. Because Zacchaeus, he worked for the Roman authorities. They were the ones that collected the taxes. And so he was seen to be in league with the enemy. And as a result, he would have been distrusted, disliked, ostracised, not invited to parties or functions, etc. The list goes on. Now, at the time, the Jews weren't really particularly oppressed, but they did not have their own king, and the foreigners, i.e. the Romans, were telling them what to do. It was tolerance, but it was tolerance under tension. So Zacchaeus' allegiance was really not to Israel at all, but to Rome, the occupiers. And so, because of all this, the people in Jericho, they probably would have walked in fear of Zacchaeus. He would have had a few friends because of his connections to his job, but really, did he have good, dependable, loyal, lasting friends? It's hard to say, but I think it's pretty fair to say that he didn't. He was lonely. Zacchaeus' wealth and power, it might have satisfied him for a little while, but he knew that there was something more and he had to change. And it seemed like he just wasn't going to be able to do that alone. And I'll go out on a limb here. I think that he also no longer liked the man that he had become. He wanted something more. He wanted to change. And perhaps that could be true for all of us. Perhaps we don't like who we have become, and perhaps we want to change. Perhaps that seems impossible because we are trapped in our own expectations. Expectations of who we should be as a mother, a father, a daughter, a son, a grandparent, a friend. What are we to do when it just seems beyond us? Perhaps we need a bigger and a clearer view of what is really going on, and perhaps we need to climb another metaphorical tree. For me, this tree analogy is easy. You see, I love trees. I love looking at them. I love crushing the leaves in my hands and smelling the scent. And despite my experience with a scary hedge from my childhood, I love climbing them. I spent a lot of time in Canada, and over there I love climbing Douglas fir trees. They're iconic Canadian trees, and they are absolutely magnificent. They are that perfect symmetrical triangle, that long, thin triangle. They have wide trunks, they have hard, tessellated, thick bark, and they have these little itsy-bitsy leaves which are all the same. And they look like they are just meant to be there. They are just majestic. And there was one tree that I particularly remembered. It was, and I really hope it still is there, it was at the top of an escarpment overlooking a really wide valley below. And I would climb it quite regularly. And it was hard going at first because Douglas fir trees, they lose their branches at lower levels. And so there's no branches for the first few metres. And so you'd have to climb using the bark. And it was strong and it was hard, but it gave really excellent handholds. And so you learnt how to use those in order to climb them. And so I'd climb on up, I'd push through all those little scrappy twigs until I settled on a large, thick branch. And I was given a fabulous view over the valley. It stretched for miles and miles and miles. Sometimes there would be snow in the winter. Sometimes there would be bison. They're American buffalo, that is. Sometimes the haze of the forest would be there after a hot Canadian day. But it was always spectacular, and I would sit up there for hours and hours, taking in the view and enjoying the different way of seeing things from way, way up there. And so too did Zacchaeus as he sat in that tree. He climbed the tree, a sycamore tree, because he couldn't see. One thing we know about Zacchaeus, how he looked, was that he was short. So he couldn't see over the crowd. They just got in his way. He'd come to see Jesus, but he couldn't see them. He was just staring at the back of heads or the back of necks or the back of shoulders. He couldn't see the one he'd come to see. So he saw this tree and he climbed it. And this act alone shows just how desperate Zacchaeus was to see Jesus. You see, because of who he was, because of his status, his job, his reputation, mingling with the crowd really was a no-go zone for him. As someone of a high status in the Roman government, a tax collector on top of that, Zacchaeus, he would never have gone on some sightseeing mission. If he'd gone out to have a bit of a look, he would have been subject to ridicule, to abuse, and perhaps even violence as he mixed with a large crowd in the city streets. And he certainly didn't have anyone to hold him up or drop him through the roof. It's unlikely, really, that he had many friends at all that could help him with this. So Zacchaeus runs ahead of the crowd and he climbs a tree. And he hopes that by doing this, he might just catch a glimpse of Jesus and see what all the fuss is about. He's absolutely desperate. And because he runs ahead, we can see that he really is desperate, because older men in robes back then, they just didn't run. This wasn't the done thing. It was shameful for them to run like this. Now, you might remember the story about the prodigal son, and his father also ran, but to do this was a very shameful thing. So we can understand here just how desperate Zacchaeus was. He would have been greatly dishonoured by running, not to mention climbing a tree. So here we see a man who is willing to do possibly anything, even bring shame upon himself, to see or even meet the man who he believes can change his life. So he must have been prompted by some extraordinarily powerful urge to see Jesus. Perhaps the loneliness that his job brought was too much for him. Perhaps he wanted to turn his back on a profession that was niggling at his conscience. But he heard about Jesus, and he heard that Jesus was shaking up the community, and in him he saw his chance to change. He wants nothing to stand in his way. Crowds, stature, honour, nothing is going to get between him and Jesus. So he's overcome his barriers to change, and so he waits in the tree. And he waits, and he waits. We don't know how long for, the text doesn't say, but he waits. And he waits. And then along comes Jesus. Now, Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem, and he is on to go to the tree that will claim his own life. But he stops under the sycamore tree that Zacchaeus is clinging to, and just as Zacchaeus is seeking him, Jesus is seeking Zacchaeus. And he says, "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." Now, Jesus knew everything about Zacchaeus. He knows everything about everybody. So he knew that he was powerful, he knew that he was rich, and he knew that he was rich because of the way that he treated other people. Jesus knew that Zacchaeus had oppressed people, he'd cheated people, he'd defrauded people to get ahead, he'd taken advantage of everybody. But Jesus loved him, and he saw the workings in Zacchaeus' heart. He knew that there was this little glimmer of the beginnings of change in Zacchaeus' heart. Zacchaeus had shown that he wanted to change, and here standing below him was the one who would change his life forever. So Zacchaeus hurries down, reaching out to the one who is reaching out to him. But as always, there are grumbling onlookers. Why are you going with him? He's a sinner. He's worthless. He's a really nasty man. He's not worth the time of day. Just move on. But Jesus does it again, just like all the other times that we read when he comes to seek out and to save the lost. Even this rich tax collector, who was, in their eyes, just as bad as you can get, even he will be saved. So what does Zacchaeus do? Well, he responds. The one who he has come to see has called out to him. He knows him by name. And so Zacchaeus hurries out of the tree when Jesus calls him. Was he a good climber? I don't know. It's hard to say. But we get the impression that he clambers down in response to Jesus. He's happy, he's welcoming, and he's changing. He's a changed man. And not just by coming down out of the tree, but we can see that he's a changed man because he repents of his sins. He confesses. He acknowledges that he has defrauded people. He's taken too much money for himself. He's taken advantage of other people so he can get ahead. He confesses that, and not just confesses, but he also wants to make right the wrongs that he has done. His heart has been changed and he wants to make restitution. His generosity, his plan to give half of what he owns, shows his changed heart. And it's not half of what he earns, that would be a lot, but it's half of what he owns. That's a lot. It's all those renovations, The extra chariots, the slaves, all those things. He's going to give half of those away. And we can see echoes of the Jewish law in his commitment to pay back 4 times as much as he had fraudulently taken. Zacchaeus is a changed man. This is the effect that Jesus had and has on people. He changes people. And Jesus says that Zacchaeus is saved and he's a son of Abraham. Jesus longed to change, perhaps just his loneliness, his social ostracism. He may not have understood the salvation that Jesus offered, but now he is changed forever. He is welcomed as a true son of Abraham, a true follower of Jesus, and all because he put his trust in Jesus, the one who could bring about this change. The onlookers were aghast. This evil rich tax collector, how could Jesus do such a thing? But as Jesus says, he came to seek out and to save the lost. Doesn't matter who they were, what they'd done, Jesus was there for them to change their lives. And Zacchaeus' life was changed forever that day. Zacchaeus faced challenges to see Jesus and he had to overcome them. And I'm sure that we all have our own challenges. Let me use the tree metaphor just one final time, if I can stretch that. I remember one time when things didn't go so well for me in a tree. It was a beautiful big gum tree. It was wide and it was tall. It had smooth bark and I climbed it up and up and up. But I lost my footing and I slid back down all the way to the bottom. It was really, really painful. I lay in the dirt on the ground, hurting. I'd grazed myself and I had quite a few cuts and bruises, and my pride was seriously hurt. But eventually I picked myself up, I headed back to the car, and I drove home where I nursed my wounds. I hadn't been wise, I'd been hasty, I'd been too confident. And so it makes me think, what are our own barriers to change? What are the things that cause us to fall out of the metaphorical tree? Perhaps we're scared of what people might think. We might hear, she or he, they're a Christian. Perhaps we wonder whether we can actually trust Jesus, if he really is who he says he is. Perhaps we put pressure on ourselves as we focus on our own obedience, that we can never be good enough. It may be hard climbing out of the tree when Jesus calls to come down to meet him. We might call out to him from the lofty heights, but then we're just too scared to come down. It's just all too far. Like me, we might be too eager and slide and fall out of the tree to be broken at the bottom. Or perhaps there are just too many branches and little twigs and leaves in your way and you just give up. It's just all too hard. Following Jesus, it's different from the way of the world, and it can be scary. You have to change the way you think. You have to change the way things you do, and I know how hard that is from first-hand experience. So like Zacchaeus, change requires that we dig into our hearts. It can look scary, and perhaps we might think that it's just all too hard for us. But Jesus is always there, calling us to come down out of our tree. He's calling us to change, to be people who are no longer lost. And he is the one who will change us. We make the decision to follow him, to come out of the tree, but it is Jesus and his Spirit who changes us. And so you might ask, how can that be? How can that happen? So Jesus can change us because he has gone before us. He died on a tree so that we might have eternal life. He hung on that tree. He came down and was raised to life. And you can see that green tree up there on our beautiful east window, that green tree. That's the tree that he hung on up there, the tree of change and the tree of life. So we too can climb down, we too can climb that metaphorical tree of Zacchaeus as we look for Jesus. And we too can come down as Jesus calls us, as he beckons us to join him. Jesus wants you to come join him. Doesn't matter how tall, how bushy, or how scary that tree is, Jesus will always make sure that you come down safely. He can work in any heart, no matter how lost you think you are. You just need to trust him and to come on down. Amen.